Welcome, everybody. My name is Miles Hanson. I'm the president and CEO of World Trade Center Utah, and we're very excited for today's webinar, our discussion with Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. Thank you for being with us. For those of you who aren't familiar with World Trade Center Utah, we are the trade promotion authority here in the state of Utah. Our sole mission and purpose is to help Utah companies grow internationally, increasing international sales, attracting international investment here to the state of Utah, and in the process, elevate Utah's global status. We are working to make Utah a global hub for trade and investment, working to, as Boyd Matheson likes to say, working to make Utah the crossroads of the world. And so if you have any issues whatsoever on any international issue, please reach out. We'd love nothing more to find out more about what you and your business are doing and how we can plug in to support. I'm very grateful today for our sponsor for today's webinar, Dorsey and Whitney. We got Troy Keller on the line. Troy, you're such a phenomenal partner, and you do so much for the business community. Thank you for that support. And also grateful to our partners, Desert News and the Salt Lake Chamber of Commerce. Very quickly up front, we're going to dive into some of Lieutenant General McMaster's lessons on leadership and strategy. And the theme of today is going to be how to restore strategic competence. We have many of his most recent book, Battlefields. And so please reach out if you are interested in a copy, and we'll make sure that we can find a way to get that to you. I've been reading it over the past week. It is absolutely phenomenal. Required reading for anybody who's engaging internationally and anybody who wants to come up with a strategy to be successful in whatever they are doing. I'm also grateful to Boyd Matheson from Desert News for being with us and helping to moderate our discussion today. Boyd, just yesterday, somebody described you as the Arthur Brooks of Utah. And I couldn't agree more. Boyd is the opinion editor at the Desert News. He is the host of KSL News Radio's Inside Sources, and just a phenomenal, partner and thinker and mentor of mine. So Boyd, thank you for being with us. And a special thanks to Lieutenant General McMaster. Thank you so much. I know you've got a lot on your plate. It is fantastic to see you again, this time on screen instead of in person. And General McMaster, I want you to know that as I've been here in Utah, I think my team and people that work with me are sick of me telling them stories about General McMaster and lessons in leadership that I learned from you. I don't read directions. I watch YouTube videos rather than looking at directions. And so I learn by observation. And I can't tell you how much I learned by observing you in your role as National Security Advisor. And that's had a tremendous impact on me in my career and has been foundational as I have worked here at World Trade Center Utah to develop our strategy and to help the state work on its international strategy. So thank you for all the lessons I've learned, and thank you for being with us today. So here's a quick overview of the program. We have an opportunity to hear from General McMaster. He'll provide some opening remarks about restoring strategic competence, hopefully share a few anecdotes from his long and storied career, and then help us figure out how to apply that to our nation, but also to our state and companies and other organizations that are out there developing and executing strategies. Boyd and I will then moderate a discussion for a few minutes and ask some questions on leadership and what's happening out there in the world. And then we want this to be interactive, so we will open up to audience Q&A. So if you have a question, please submit that to Hannah through the Q&A function, and we'll make sure that we get through as many of those as we have time for today. With that, General McMaster, thank you for being with us. General McMaster is currently a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Of course, we know him as a former National Security Advisor, and perhaps most importantly, he's retired, Lieutenant General in the Army. Thank you for your 34 years of service in our Army across multiple theaters around the world, and that's everything you've done. That service in the military is first and foremost in our minds. So thank you for your service. Thank you for being with us. And with that, sir, I will go ahead and turn the time over to you.
Hey, Miles. Hey, thanks. It is great to see you, and I can't thank you enough for your distinguished service on the National Security Council staff. You made tremendous contributions there, and I think it's amazing what you're doing now, because I think much of what we worked on in Washington, we realized as we worked on these challenges to national security and the need for us to compete more effectively, that these competitions are not just government or public sector competitions. They cross over into the private sector. So it's a real privilege to be with this great audience, and I can't thank Boyd and Troy and Hannah, the whole team enough for the opportunity. Yeah, I thought what I might do is just begin with just an overview of the argument in the book, an argument for improved strategic competence as well as confidence in our ability to implement a sound and an effective approach to foreign policy and national security. And I begin the story in battlegrounds with my experience in the Second Armored Cavalry Regiment in Germany during the Cold War. And in 1989, the troopers of Eagle Troop's Second Armored Cavalry Regiment were patrolling the East-West German border and went from 1 minute staring down East German border guards to the next minute seeing the gates thrown open along that frontier between East Germany and West Germany near Coburg, which is where Martin Luther translated the Bible into German. And it's also home to really, really good beer, by the way, as well. But you saw, as those gates came open, you saw first, tens and then hundreds and then thousands and then tens of thousands of East Germans crossing into West Germany bearing bouquets of flowers and bottles of wine. There were hugs and tears of joy, right? And then of course the East German government faded away. The Soviet Union broke apart. We'd won the Cold War. So there was reason for a lot of optimism. And of course that was followed almost exactly a year later. That same cavalry troop, and I was the commander of that troop, deployed to Operation Desert Shield and then Desert Storm, which is hard to believe that's 30 years ago, right? I mean, 30 years ago today, the air war was ongoing. And 30 years ago, on February 26th of 1991, that same cavalry troop was attacking into Iraq to defeat the Iraqi Republican Guard. And then as the first step, we were the vanguard of the so-called left hook. And as a first step of returning Kuwait to the Kuwaitis. Our troop encountered in the midst of a sandstorm a much larger enemy defending force from the Tawakana Division of the Republican Guard, and in a 23-minute, very intense armored battle, defeated a force about 4 times our size and suffered no casualties. And of course, that was just one lopsided victory in a war that was full of lopsided victories, military victories against the world's 4th largest army. And so I think, and what I write about in Battlegrounds is this was the beginning of a very high degree of optimism. And I think that carried over into over-optimism, and over-optimism that was based on 3 fundamentally flawed assumptions about the nature of the post-Cold War period. First of all, there was an arc of history, right? The arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. A related assumption that great power competition was a relic of the past, right? A condominium of nations would emerge and we'd cooperate to solve global challenges. And then the third flawed assumption was that our technological military prowess, as demonstrated in the Gulf War, would guarantee our security far into the future. And if any foe had the temerity of challenging us, that war would be fought quickly, cheaply, efficiently. And Miles, I read in Battlegrounds is this was a setup. It was a setup for strategic shocks and disappointments in the 2000s, beginning with the most devastating terrorist attack in history on 9/11. The unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We often want to debate, should we have done it? It being the invasion of Iraq in 2003, I think we should debate who the heck thought it would be easy. Why did they think it would be easy? And then, of course, we had the financial crisis, 2008, 2009. And as the Obama administration came in, I think that emotional impetus behind our foreign policy shifted from over-optimism to pessimism, and then resignation about complex challenges. And I think an associated belief that our disengagement from complex problems was an unmitigated good. And I think what we have in common between maybe an undervaluing of the risks and costs of action, like the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and undervaluing the risk and cost of inaction or disengagement, like the complete withdrawal from Iraq in December 2011 that set conditions for the rise of ISIS, the most destructive terrorist organization in history, an organization that took control of territory the size of Britain, or the unenforced red line in Syria in 2013, for example. What these have in common is what I call in the book strategic narcissism, the tendency to define the world only in relation to us and to think that what we do or decide not to do is decisive toward a favorable outcome. Now, this is a problem because it's self-referential. It's a problem because it doesn't account for the agency, the influence, the authorship over the future that others have, in particular, rivals, adversaries, and enemies. So the argument in the book is for strategic empathy, to pay more attention to the other, to consider the emotions, the aspirations, the ideology that drives and constrains the other, and then therefore to recognize the need to compete and to compete much more effectively with a higher degree of strategic competence. And I'd like to talk more about the components of that. But I'm really anxious to hear where you'd like to take the conversation. What I write about in the book is the need for us to regain our competence in these key competitions against the Chinese Communist Party that is becoming increasingly aggressive at extending and tightening its exclusive grip on power internally and exporting its authoritarian mercantilist model externally. Vladimir Putin's Kremlin, which is determined because he knows he can't compete with us on our own terms, right? Russia's economy is the size of Italy's. He wants to drag us all down, by dividing us, polarizing us, pitting us against each other, diminishing our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes under the theory that, hey, he can be the last man standing as he watches Europe and the United States destroy itself. And then, of course, we have hostile states of Iran and North Korea. We could talk about that and the emotions, ideology, and aspirations to drive and constrain them. And then we still have the problem of jihadist terrorism that is centered mainly in South Asia and the Middle East, and interacts with other problem sets. And then finally, these new arenas of competition, new domains of competition. Space is a competitive domain now, and of course, cyberspace and the interconnected problems of climate change and energy security and health and security and food and water security. So the threats and the promise associated with emerging technologies. So what I tried to do in the book, Miles, is explain these challenges as a way to bring Americans and citizens across really the free world together for conversations about these challenges, to deepen our understanding and to understand better how we can work together to overcome them. And in so doing, I hope to help reverse some of the polarization we see in our society, some of the divisions that are diminishing our confidence, right? Our confidence in who we are as a people and in our common identity, and our confidence in our ability to compete effectively with a sustained approach to foreign policy. So I look forward to the conversation, Miles. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
That overview. And what I love about your book and your framework for strategic competence is it really dials it down to the human level. I think it's easy for all of us when it comes to foreign policy and national security. It's easy to think of the world as a game of risk, right? We talk about China, Iran, Russia. You look at a map, you get all these different shapes, they're different colors. And it's easy to think about, a very realpolitik kind of realist perspective that these are, individual actors, these countries that are acting against each other in this game of risk. And one of my biggest lessons learned from living overseas, serving in doing foreign policy stuff, diplomacy, working in national security issues in Washington, D.C., is decisions that countries made are ultimately the cumulative effect of individual choices that people are making. So you talk about narcissism, you talk about empathy, humility, confidence. Those are things that we describe to individuals. And that helps us create a better framework for thinking about how other countries are acting, because at the end of the day, it's individuals making choices. And so I think that your contribution in that regard is very, very unique, but spot on and critical for all of us as we think about the strategies that we're formulating, whether at the national level, state level, companies or organizations, that we can't just sit back and come up with strategies based on these entities, but there are people in those entities. And if we want to be competitive, we have to think about where they are going, independent of what we do, and make sure that we calibrate strategies to get out in front of that and to shape that in a way that's going to be beneficial for our interests, however we want to define that, whether it's on an individual level or a national level or somewhere in between. So thank you for that overview. Boyd, you are a master at discussion. The way that we've talked about this is we want this to be like we're sitting around the kitchen table, or we're grabbing coffee somewhere. We're having an informal conversation. We've got a couple hundred people, joining us on Zoom and others watching on YouTube right now. But let's keep this informal. Boyd, I'll kick it over to you. Why don't you go ahead and ask a question or two, and we can get the discussion going.
All right. I have so many questions. This is going to be a long lunch, so I hope everyone's settling in. General, it's so great to be with you today, and I really want to begin with this idea of leadership. And I think so many of the things that you espoused, they're principle-based, and it really leads to that area of confidence. Confidence is never arrogance, and you point out so powerfully between that strategic narcissism and strategic empathy. To me, every single person on this call, every leader, whether that's a small business, whether it's a large corporation, a county, a state, or a nation, the same leadership principles apply. And so the first thing I wanted to get to is give us some background, some perspective in terms of your developing your leadership strategy and your principled approach to leadership. Who influenced it? What did you learn? And what are you continuing to learn?
Well, hey, thanks, Boyd. I had this great gift of service in our Army for 34 years, and before that, I was at West Point, and before that, I begged my parents to go to Valley Forge Military Academy because I always, since my earliest memory, wanted to serve in our military. And the reason I wanted to serve is, I wanted to be part of something bigger than myself. I wanted to be part of a team in which members of that team are committed to each other and bound together by mutual trust, common purpose, and as so happens in a good military unit, one that's well led and sets high standards for itself, bonds of affection, and a team that takes on the quality of a family, really. And so this is one of the greatest rewards of service in our military, is to be part of organizations like that, and to be part of endeavors that make a real difference in preserving peace and fighting the enemies of all civilized people, as we had against these jihadist terrorist organizations, for example, in recent years. And I think of American warriors as warriors and humanitarians, because of the righteous nature of the missions that we've been involved in, against these enemies of all humanity, and of course what we've achieved over the centuries, and particularly in connection with defeating Nazism, Japanese imperialism, communist totalitarianism, and so I really feel like you want to join an organization, be part of an organization that is committed to excellence and committed to some sort of altruistic aim. Now, and as a leader, I've learned a lot from mentors, those who I admired, who are particularly effective leaders at building organizations like that, that are bound together by mutual trust and respect and common purpose, and committed to excellence, organizations where excellence becomes self-sustaining, and you set high standards for one another. But I've learned a lot from my soldiers and my sergeants, and I think that what you can do as a leader, maybe more than anything else, is provide a vision, but provide a vision that's based on collaboration and soliciting others' views of, what do you think our mission should be? How should we work together more effectively? Capturing that in a discussion, and then seeking a common commitment across your organization, to that mission and the principles associated with it, and what the expectations are going to be for one another, within that organization. And then I think you can also learn from members of your team by always asking them how. Once you establish kind of the objectives you want to achieve, ask your team, hey, how can we accelerate progress to these objectives? How can we be more effective together? Because guess what? Then you get ownership, obviously, among everyone. It's not your plan. Hey, let me tell you how we're going to do things in this organization. It's something that you've developed, from collaboration, and you have a mutual commitment to it, within your organization. I think leaders sometimes, where they make mistakes, is they don't recognize, Boyd, how influential they really are. And I think in many organizations, certainly in the military, right? Your soldiers, your unit will adopt your standards, right? People watch you carefully, and if you want people to treat each other respectfully, treat others with respect, right? If you think, a certain aspect of your business, for me, it was always training, and preparing for combat, and always improving our combat effectiveness. Well, if that's the most important thing to you, hey, it's probably pretty important that you be there and you demonstrate your commitment, to that priority. So, these are lessons you learn, across a career. But I would think, Boyd, I'll say one final thing. I think leaders' effectiveness depends probably primarily on what their base motivation is, and is your base motivation as a leader to do the best job you can for your mission and for your people, or is your motivation to get to the next level yourself, right? Or is your motivation for some other agenda, right? And so, I think leaders make the best decisions when they prioritize the mission and those who are in their charge, their welfare, and well-being. And then that actually tends to simplify a leader's decisions, right? Once you have that kind of commitment.
Wonderful. Miles?
General McMaster, you are somebody that you don't just talk the talk, but you walk the walk. And on those lessons of leadership, it just reminded me back of the opportunity to serve with you at the National Security Council. And I think we've all been in organizations where the team exists to support the leader, but the culture that you developed was the other way around. The leader existed to support each and every one of us, and you helped set the vision and you created a culture, but we all felt empowered as leaders within our portfolios to go out and move full steam ahead. And we always knew that if we needed some assistance, we could turn to you. And so thank you for that. But what you are describing is a hallmark of your service and the team that you built at the National Security Council, and that's true throughout your career. So thank you for that. I want to jump in and talk about a few specific countries here. We have Mr. Kaso Sanani on the line with us today. I know, Kaso, you have to drop off here. For those in Utah that don't know Mr. Sanani, he is a phenomenal Utah business leader, also has a lot of great international experience and a lot of expertise in Iran. He's published books and articles about Iran that are I think, are very important and timely. And so, Mr. Sanani, I want to turn to you quickly before you need to drop to give you an opportunity to ask a question on a topic that I know is near and dear to your heart, which is Iran. Let's see, Kas, if you're there, you're on mute, so we may not be able to, we're not hearing you. Okay, let's go ahead and pause there. We can circle back, Kas, here, but let's get one more question in. General McMaster, as you look at the White House today, right, we have a new administration, a new team is coming in, but you don't get to reset the stage, what's happening out there in the world. What do you feel like was the most difficult issue that you worked on? And what do you think, what advice would you have for the Biden administration as they take that issue on and they continue to lead out on our global engagement?
Okay, so Miles, I'll cover what I think is probably the most significant, and then maybe the most difficult to deal with, right? But the most significant, I think, is the competition with China. And I think that we're talking about how to lead effectively in large organizations. I think one of the things a leader has to do is continuously scrutinize the assumptions on which your efforts are based, right? And oftentimes when you see organizations on a path to failure, it's because there are implicit assumptions that underpin their efforts. And because those assumptions are implicit, they're not really challenged. And so what we endeavored to do is put into place in the National Security Council staff, remember the principal small group framing sessions, right? That's a mouthful, but it was essentially an effort to apply design thinking and problem framing to what we considered our top, I think initially was 16 challenges to national security and prosperity and to our future as Americans. And top among those was the challenge posed by the increasingly aggressive actions of the Chinese Communist Party. And when we framed it, when we scrutinized previous policy, we recognized that previous policy was based on the assumption that China, having been welcomed into the international order, would play by the rules. And as China prospered, would liberalize its economy and liberalize its form of government. Well, it was painfully apparent by 2017, right? That was not going to happen. And so we put in place a series of new assumptions. If you're interested more in this document, it was declassified 3 weeks ago, and it's under the Indo-Pacific strategy, and it's available on the internet. And I think this was a very strong conceptual foundation for a new approach to China. So I think that's going to remain our greatest challenge. It's going to be the greatest challenge for the Biden administration as well. And I think so far, what the Biden administration has said, members of the administration, Tony Blinken, the new Secretary of State in particular, has been encouraging. So I hope that this is an element of continuity across multiple administrations to shift from an approach of cooperation and engagement with the Chinese Communist Party under these flawed assumptions to one of transparent competition in recognition that the party is exporting its authoritarian mercantilist model at our expense and is also guilty of egregious human rights violations internally to extend and tighten the Chinese Communist Party's exclusive grip on power. The most difficult topic to deal with was the Afghanistan War, and that, I got kind of chewed up in that process because I wanted to present the president with multiple options. and to highlight to the president and others the costs and risks of complete disengagement from Afghanistan. I think what resulted from that effort was the August 2017 South Asia strategy, which I would argue, Miles, was the first time we have had in place a reasonable, logical, and sustainable approach to the war in Afghanistan and the problem set more broadly in South Asia across the whole long history of our involvement since 2001. And what makes me sad about the Afghanistan war is, there is, all the professions of war weariness and wanting to end endless wars and so forth. That's understandable from the American people because it hasn't been a 20-year war. It's been a one-year war fought 20 times over. And so I'm very concerned about the strategy there now. The Trump administration, after I left Washington, kind of doubled down, I would say, on the flaws of the Obama administration's approach to Afghanistan, and in kind of an extreme form of strategic narcissism, conjured up the enemy we would prefer to have in Afghanistan rather than the actual enemy that is there. And made this assumption that the Taliban has a bold line between them and Al Qaeda and other jihadist terrorists who want to continue to use mass murder as their principal tactic against all civilized peoples. And we did, I think, something that was unethical as well as unwise with the Taliban and this agreement and negotiations during which we made far too many concessions. Pressuring the Afghans to release 5,000 of the most heinous people on earth, and then not insisting on a ceasefire as the Taliban continued heinous attacks. I mean, on a maternity hospital, Miles, where they gunned down expectant mothers and infants during the negotiation process, and we didn't walk away. And in fact, now we have forced the Afghan government and their representatives to sit with the Taliban in Qatar, and the Taliban are sitting across from them and saying, "Hey, why are we even talking to you? We defeated the world's greatest superpower, but they didn't defeat us. We defeated ourselves in large measure." I hope the Biden administration reverses that because, of course, it's hard for me to imagine what does power sharing with the Taliban look like. Is that mass executions in the soccer stadium every other Saturday? Is that every other girls' school bulldozed? So this is an area in which we have real hard interests in terms of denying jihadist terrorists an ability to establish a safe haven and support base. But there are very significant humanitarian concerns there as well.
Yeah. No, you look at Afghanistan, and it also reminds me of JCPOA. When our objective becomes to get a deal, usually we end up with a pretty bad deal because there are other actors, right? They want to go, they want to accomplish their objectives. And if we find a deal, then that's a pretty weak place to negotiate from. And it very much seemed like over the past 18 months, from the U.S. perspective, we wanted a deal. They knew that. And so they got a deal that was favorable on their terms and not a deal that protected and advanced our interests or our partners and allies in the region. So right next door to Afghanistan, we've got Iran. Mr. Samnani, it looks like we can see you now. I want to go ahead and give you an opportunity to share your perspective on Iran and ask General McMaster a question.
Thank you very much, Miles. General McMaster, it's an honor to visit with you. I was always looking forward to have an opportunity. I have a friend of mine who works at Hoover Institute, Dr. Milani. You probably know of him or know him. Anyway, just wanted to make a comment regarding Iran and the triangle that exists between Iran, China, and United States. If you really look at that and the issues that is related to economy as well as politics of the region. What I really would like to ask you a question is, how do you see the relationship between China and Iran and the influence of China in Iran and in return availability of energy in form of natural gas as well as oil to China, which in turn has an effect on the ability of the U.S. industries to be able to compete with China production. As an example, today we know that the production of steel in China is 3 times more than the United States. Since I'm an industry person myself, although I'm a physicist, nuclear physicist by education, but because of the availability of the cheap energy to China and being able to process steel, we are not able to compete, and we cannot. Our industries, not only steel, other industries have problems to compete. Can you talk about that? And You mentioned something about Germany, that while you were during the Second World War in Germany, and later on the opening East and West, and how well Americans and Germans, they were happy to visit with each other. I believe there should be a day that where Iranian people and American people can be friends again, as they have been in the past. I just want to see what you have any thoughts regarding that, and I'll be quiet and listen. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Cosmo, thank you. Great to meet you. And Boss Milan is a dear friend of mine. What a wonderful person. And thanks for bringing him up. And I've learned quite a bit from him over the years, going back to when we first met. I think back in 2002, 2003, I think is when we first met. But hey, I would just say that what you're bringing up is an extremely important point, which is the need to integrate economic policy and foreign policy and national security efforts. And we in our highly readable national security strategy that we developed during that first year of the Trump administration in December 2017, I'd recommend looking at it, actually, because I do think if you do a word search for America First and maybe delete that if that offends you, I believe we wrote it from a nonpartisan perspective, and I think it should be a sustained approach to foreign policy. And in it, we stressed how economic and national security policy interact and have to be synergistic. And there's a pillar, that's organized by pillars of our national interests, and promoting prosperity is one of those pillars. And we have the quote in there, economic security is national security. And I think that this was one of the flaws of the JCPOA, right? The Iran nuclear deal, is that it was, I believe it was a political disaster masquerading as a diplomatic triumph in large measure, because it gave the regime the resources it needed to intensify its 4-decade-long proxy war against the great Satan, us from the perspective of the revolutionaries who are in power there, the little Satan, Israel, and the Arab monarchies. And what those who negotiated the deal said, oh, well, we're going to separate that, right? We're not going to talk about Iran's destructive behavior. What we really want is just get this deal. But the deal not only was flawed in connection with, the sunset clause, not having missiles covered, and inadequate verification of the deal, but it gave the regime the resources it needed through sanctions relief and through a big payoff, just up front, like in cash, to infuse the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, with more resources. And I think what we neglected to realize is that the regime, is those who are the beneficial owners of most of the companies now in Iran is the IRGC, and it's the bunyads, as you know, the bunyads, who are mainly the children of the ruling clerical order, this dictatorial theocracy that's in power. And we neglected, I think, to really examine, to have a degree of strategic empathy, to understand who's really in charge. And as you know, there was a struggle from the beginning in 1979, the overlooked period of the Civil War, between what you might call the Republicans and the revolutionaries. But sadly, the revolutionaries won and are in power. And they can put forward a Zarif who speaks the Queen's English and puts forward a good face to the world, and a President Rouhani. But they are the shop windows, for the Supreme Leader, the Guardian Council, and the IRGC. So I think what we need to do is to recognize that the regime will use additional resources if it gets access to them, to intensify the proxy war, and to keep the pressure on, I think, Iran. This is where Abbas and I sometimes disagree, to force them to make a choice. The chapter in Battlegrounds, which I recommend what we do, is called Forcing a Choice. Force the regime to make a choice between being a responsible nation and being treated as such and being integrated back into the economy, or to suffer the consequences of continuing to intensify its support for militias and terrorist organizations across the region, and really kind of to apply the Hezbollah model more broadly in the region, in which Iran, I think, is endeavoring to keep the Arab world perpetually weak and enmeshed in sectarian conflict, as a way to pursue its designs across the region, extend its influence, and to threaten Israel by placing a proxy war on its border. So I think, I hope, and I'll tell you again, this is an area that's been kind of encouraging, right? Because Tony Blinken, when he testified, I don't know if you had a chance to listen to it, But he said, hey, we know we're not going to be able to turn the clock back to 2015 and the Iran nuclear deal. And what we need to do initially is to see Iran come back into compliance, first of all, but then also Iran has to have a willingness to address its destructive behavior in the region and address some other problems associated with the missile program, for example. So, we'll see what happens. But so far, I think there's some positive indications about the Obama administration's policy. Hey, I'll just say quickly on energy security and cheap energy and the advantage that it gives us in advanced manufacturing and other sectors. I am skeptical, about this Biden administration, and I think there's a significant downside to it. Announcement of the moratorium on drilling for oil and gas, in the U.S. and in federal lands and waters. I believe that it is in our interest to continue to ensure our own self-sufficiency from an energy perspective and to be a net exporter, especially of LNG. The greatest reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, man-made greenhouse gas emissions in history, was our conversion from coal to cheap gas in the United States. And to reduce that opportunity associated with LNG exports not only reduces the ability to have that bridge in place of cleaner, of a cleaner fossil-based fuel as we get to renewables, but it also reduces our ability to ensure that others don't wield coercive economic power based on energy supplies, Russia in particular, right? So economic policy does relate to national security. I hope the Biden administration works on that connection. And in terms of China's sponsorship now of Iran, and you probably saw the strategic agreement that was deliberately leaked by them recently. That it's a cause for concern. But I think if the United States stays tough, on sanctions, China's not going to be able to alleviate the pressure that the regime feels at this moment. As you know, probably from friends you're in contact with, the regime's very nervous, about, really not only the stagnation, but the significant recession in the economy. And one thing I wish, is that we should not take credit for that, right? It's not our sanctions. It's the corrupt regime that we should give full credit to, for the economic difficulties that Iran is encountering. And, the growing dissatisfaction with the regime is seen with the protest, after the killing of Qasem Soleimani, which I believe was important and a justified use of violence against someone who's been waging this proxy war against us. There were protests, but those protests turned against the government with the shoot down of the Ukrainian airliner. So, I think it's really hard to predict what's going to happen internally to Iran. You probably have a much better chance of doing that than I do. But I would argue for continuity in policy on Iran as well. I think you're still muted.
I think we lost his sound.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boyd. Thank you so much.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, Boyd, over to you.
Okay, General, I want to talk about some strategic threats. You've laid out a couple here, and I want to attack this in two parts, just based on what you're saying. So one, I really think the leadership quality for the 21st century that you're really articulating is being able to figure out the difference between allies and alliances. That we've got to compete head to head with Russia and with China on a host of things, but we also need an alliance with them to deal with North Korea and other issues. And so I'd love to hear some leadership component there in terms of how do we make sure we keep our allies close, and how do we have strategic alliances to deal with some of these strategic threats. And then I want to ask you a back-end question on that as it relates to the strategic threats. The national debt. I know the economics of it you've talked about often as part of our national security threat. So if you could hit both of those.
Okay. Well, thanks. I'll tell you, I think it's really important for us to communicate effectively, obviously, with allies and partners, and to achieve with an idea of achieving common purpose, right? Common understanding can lead to common purpose and then common efforts. And I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding. Maybe I'll just use the competition with the aggressive actions of the Chinese Communist Party as an example. But there's a misunderstanding that, hey, this is really a problem between Washington and Beijing. Well, I mean, I would just say, hey, just take a look at COVID-19, right? And foisting it on the world, suppressing the news of human to human transmission, punishing the doctors who were trying to ring the alarm bells about it, expelling and imprisoning the journalists who were writing about it, adding insult to injury, right? With this wolf warrior diplomacy aimed at Europe and at the United States. Hey, how about bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier? Or the greatest land grab in history if they succeed in the South China Sea and ramming and sinking Vietnamese vessels? How about the extension of the party's repressive arm into Hong Kong? Or how about the economic coercion that's aimed at Australia right now? I mean, I could go on, right? But I won't. But I mean, massive cyber attacks against us, right? So, hey, how again is this a U.S. China problem? It's not, right? I think we have to emphasize, hey, this is a free world. This is an all world, China problem, and obviously it's a Chinese people, Chinese Communist Party problem, because so many have been subjected to this genocidal campaign in Xinjiang or the extension of the party's repressive arm into Hong Kong. So I think common understanding of the problem is very important. And what I endeavored to do, and Miles was part of, is to engage our allies early, right? And to get them to participate in this problem framing. So, for example, we used the Quint format of the United States, France, Germany, England, and Italy, UK and Italy, to convene around what we picked as our top five, right? Five of us, top five challenges. Each of us took the lead in framing one, but doing so in a collaborative manner with not only our National Security Council staffs, but those representatives from departments, the relevant departments and agencies. And what we did is we paid particular attention to a common understanding of the problem. What was at stake for us? What was, how was this a threat to our mutual interests? And then we crafted overarching goals and more specific objectives. And then, very importantly, we identified our competitive advantages relative to one another, and then how we could work in harmony, synergistically, right, to overcome obstacles to progress and take advantage of opportunities and accomplish those objectives. I think that really paid off, and we began to work very effectively together. We took a similar approach with other partner nations in the Middle East on certain problem sets. But oftentimes, I think in the U.S., and again, this is maybe a function of strategic narcissism or a result of it, we develop our plan, we develop a great plan in our minds, and then we take it around the world and say, hey, sign up for this, but I think we have to actually bring people in earlier. And I think with China, this is immensely important, especially in the economic dimensions of the competition with China. I think some critical areas involve international data standards, and standard setting, for example. I think it's reciprocal access to the Chinese market, protection of intellectual property, internet privacy standards. These are all really important issues that we have to work together, and with the European Union, with the UK, with Japan, with India, and to work together effectively in a collaborative manner. And hey, on national debt, I'll just say, washed up generals like me should be careful when you're talking about economics, right? And I'm here, I'm here at the Hoover Institution with a lot of great economists. I mean, they're just phenomenal people, right? So, John Taylor is here, and John Cochran, and gosh, we just have a tremendous group of John Kogan, and others, who are really, world renowned. So I would defer to them. I think there's concern over it, but as you know, there's a big debate these days, right? I mean, was Keynes right? Can we just print more money? And will it be okay? I really, the extent of my knowledge, I would say, Boyd, is what I've read in The Economist about the danger of inflation returning and so forth, and the effect that would have on us if we are now indebted to the degree that we are, and see a rise in interest rates. That could really constrain the federal government's ability to sustain federal programs and our military and so forth. So I'm concerned about it. I know you probably know a heck of a lot more than I do about it. So I would probably pass on rendering judgment on how grave the danger is associated with with the growing deficits and the growing national debt.
Great. We've got so many business leaders on the program with us today, and they're all looking and listening to these things, both in terms of how it relates to a Utah organization functioning internationally, But so many of these principles that you talk about in the book, and so many things that you have applied, are really business centric. I spent a lot of time doing business consulting. You lay out a strategy that every business leader should be looking at. And so I always like to get to the therefore what question. So for these business leaders that are joining us on the program today, what's the therefore what? What do you hope that people will think differently? What do you hope they'll do differently as a result of a lot of these principles that you're sharing with us today?
Well, hey, thanks. I mean, I really, this book was it was a continuation of my own self-education, right? And I'm in a great place to do it here at the Hoover Institution and at Stanford. I work with amazing research assistants and have tremendous colleagues here. In the economists, I mean, area, I should remember Ed Lazier, who was a very famous economist who recently passed away. So God rest his soul, and deepest condolences to his family. What a phenomenal person, as well as an accomplished economist. But I think what I took away from this self-education process, across my career, and then in writing the book is that these really are competitions that cannot be just done in the public sector or with the government. It does cross over into all of our society and into the private sector. And I think what we can learn from it is to first try to frame these complex challenges, understand them on their own terms, one of the key elements of that understanding, kind of predictably for me to say this because I'm a historian, is to understand how the recent past produced the present as the first step of making a grounded projection into the future. Also to recognize that progress in life, progress in business, I'm sure all of or in foreign policy is never linear. And it's never linear because of the continuous interaction with a complex environment and with competitors. And so what we need maybe a sound and sustained approach, but we also need a high degree of flexibility in implementation. I think also what's important is to recognize that to be effective, you do need a degree of decentralization, right? In our, what we've seen with COVID-19, right? We're a federal system. We have, we need a common approach between the federal government, the state governments, at the county level, and between the public and private sectors, because our healthcare system, is a mixture of public and private systems. And I think if you see the breakdowns in the COVID-19 response, it has been due to a lack of common understanding and a lack of effective coordination of efforts. So leaders have to set the right conditions for that. They have to have an infrastructure for that kind of collaboration and common understanding. And then they have to be able to drive, the effective response to something like a COVID-19 crisis in a way that allows others to proceed in a decentralized manner, to take initiative, but to do so under a common concept, right? And so that's what I've tried to do in the book, is to provide a common concept for these competitions that cross over. And I'll just use one more example from a business perspective. This competition with the Chinese Communist Party has to involve business leaders, international business leaders, as well as U.S. leaders. And I think it's past time for us to take almost a Hippocratic oath for doing business in China and with Chinese entities. And of course, that's to do no harm, and to do no harm in three particular areas. First of all, not to aid and abet the Chinese Communist Party's efforts to gain an unfair and differential advantage over us in the emerging data-driven global economy or from a military perspective. This is dangerous because China operates under a program called military civil fusion. They don't distinguish between private companies and the government. In fact, their companies have to act as an extension of the Chinese Communist Party. The second area is not to aid and abet the Chinese Communist Party's efforts to extinguish human rights for their citizens by helping them through investments in Chinese companies that are complicit in this, for example, in extending this Orwellian surveillance police state within China and tightening its grip on the Chinese people. And the third, I would say, and I think this should involve conversations in every boardroom across the country, don't compromise the long-term viability of your company and the jobs of your workers in pursuit of increased quarterly profits, and to succumb to the lure of the access to the Chinese market or the lure of Chinese investment that then forces you, right, to compromise by transferring your technologies and intellectual property to a Chinese company, which then must act as an arm of the government that then will enjoy subsidies that will allow it to produce goods at artificially low costs, dump them on the international market, and drive you out of business. And we've seen this in so many cases. I mean, look at just renewable energy is an example. That sector. Look at batteries, and high storage batteries. Look at the prospect of this happening now with electric vehicles. So remember the experience of companies like GE, who went to China and said, "Hey, I can't pass up on this great deal." Well, how did that work out? Or many other companies who did the same thing. Some of our companies have been complicit in helping them build the Great Firewall. And I don't think that's a good thing. So, I think it didn't turn out the way we hoped. I'm not criticizing these companies. They were operating under fundamentally different assumptions, right? That the Chinese Communist Party would change, right? People like Xi Jinping would be like the Grinch at Christmas, right? His heart would grow 2 sizes bigger. But it didn't work out. It didn't work out. So we need a new approach, and I think this is a perfect example of how, really I think increasingly our companies and the private sector is right at the center of these competitions.
Great insight. Miles, over to you.
Yep. Thank you, Boyd. And thank you, General McMaster. So we've been getting a lot of great questions coming in from the audience, and they've been focused on China, Iran, energy strategy, Afghanistan leadership, topics that we're talking about. So thank you, everybody, for submitting those. Troy, you reached out. I know that you've got a great question. Why don't we go ahead and hear from you, Troy? Go ahead, ask your question.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Miles, and General McMaster. Thank you. This is fascinating. I could listen to you all day. I can have a really short one that I think is very topical. The Buy America policies that have seemed popular on both sides of the aisle. And this is the idea to make America more self-sufficient, support U.S. manufacturing, to promote government and other buying to basically prioritize U.S.-made goods. That seems to be continuing under the Biden administration. How do you feel about that trend, in particular for its impact on business in the long term? Thank you again.
Right. Hey, I think we have to be careful about it, right? And this is where where does economic statecraft, and the need to recognize the connection between foreign policy, national security, and trade policy, for example, cross over into industrial policy that could ultimately reduce our competitiveness and also harm American consumers. I have a colleague here at the Hoover Institution. We do a weekly talk show called Goodfellows, right? And one of my colleagues is the grumpy economist John Cochran, and he says, hey, if China wants to produce goods at artificially low prices and send them to our consumers to buy, we should send them a box of chocolates, And but I say to him, hey, but this has huge security implications. So we have this debate back and forth. I think what we should do is make reasoned decisions, sector by sector, commodity by commodity, based on the degree to which importing from a single source, for example, results in unacceptable fragility in our supply chains. And so I think a way to think about this is to recognize the need for efficiency, right? The need for cost effectiveness, and recognize that benefits American consumers, reduces costs of certain services and so forth. But to recognize that these supply chains must also be resilient, right? And not put our companies and our workers at a disadvantage because of unfair trade and economic practices. Of course, like China's state support for its national champion state-owned enterprises. So I think it's important to look at it from sector to sector. I think where we really saw a dramatic example of the need for intervention, in the private sector, but by the government, was in how fragile our supply chains had become, that made us more vulnerable to COVID-19, especially in personal protective equipment and in pharmaceuticals. Now, that doesn't mean that all of our pharmaceutical manufacturing should be in one location in Utah, right? For example, it means that we should have resilience in the supply chain and be able to get particularly crucial commodities from multiple sources. And so I think that's the way to think about it. And I think that there's not going to be one overall policy that fits all. I think this Buy American policy sounds great, but we have to consider the second and third, I think order effects of that, and how it could put us at a disadvantage in some instances. But I think what the Trump administration did, and I'm sure what the Biden administration will continue by invigorating the CFIUS process, the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States, so that we could look, I think, in a more critical manner at investment in our companies, and then also what we've done by also requiring that foreign companies meet the reporting requirements if they're going to list on U.S. exchanges. I think that's really important, for example. And I think looking at specific supply chains like pharmaceuticals, and like PPE, and like communications equipment, right, to make sure that the Chinese Communist Party, isn't inside your house right now, with the Clean Path Initiative, Clean Store Initiative, Clean Square Initiative that Keith Kroc, who was a great undersecretary for econ, by the way, put in place. So, yeah, I don't think I don't have a good short answer. Sorry about this, but I think it's going to be case by case, and we have to always consider the second and third order effects of these economic decisions.
Great question, Troy. And General McMaster, I think you're spot on. And one thing you highlight is these are difficult, complex issues, but they're critical for our national security, for our economic security, and it's critical for the success of businesses that are operating in this environment. And so for any Utah companies, as you're grappling with this, and as you're trying to figure out, what does this mean for me and my company, please reach out to us at World Trade Center Utah. We'd be more than happy to sit down, to have a conversation, make sure we can connect you with the experts who can dial in and go deep with you and your company so you can make smart decisions. They're going to put you on a path towards competitive success in the months and the years ahead, because the international landscape is changing, and so these economic issues are fundamentally changing. I think China is a great example of that. Early on in a trade dispute between the Trump administration and China, I hear a lot from Utah companies that said, man, we just got to get a deal so things can go back to the way they used to be, go back to normal. And the message that we've been preaching is that there's no going back to normal. This relationship is fundamentally changed, and whether it's a Republican administration or Democratic administration, things are not going to be the way they were for the first 40 years of the U.S.-China bilateral relationship. And what that means is companies need to take a very close look at their strategies, look at the risk and exposure that they had, and then develop business plans that take that into account. And I love the Hippocratic Oath that you laid out, General McMaster. I'm taking notes there, and we're going to be using that as we move forward to help make sure we're supporting Utah companies on making sound decisions as it relates to China, but also, Troy, to your point, on these other policies, some domestic, some international, that impact business. Well, General McMaster, I'm mindful of time. I'm very grateful to everybody who is joining us live and everybody who will watch after the fact. This has been a phenomenal conversation. I've learned a lot. I've been taking notes, and I strongly encourage everybody who's been listening today to do the same. Boyd, I think you set it up perfectly. We don't do these things just to have a nice conversation, as nice and as enjoyable as it is. We judge our success by the positive action that all of us take as a result of the conversation that we've had today. So, General McMaster, you have taught us, you've given us lessons and helped tee us up to go and take some action accordingly so that we can continue to help Utah compete and win here at home, across the country, and from our perspective, around the world. So thank you, General McMaster, for being with us. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks again for the opportunity. If I want to just say something just quickly in closing, everybody's part of these competitions. Obviously, it's great the work that you're doing, Miles. And I think that, there are private sector solutions developing for this. I use an example in the book, Battlegrounds. I use a company called Strider, which I think is Utah-based, that helps companies, figure out, what their exposure is to this kind of coercion by a foreign authoritarian power, China mainly, and infiltration and so forth. So there are so many examples, positive examples happening out there. You're one of them, I think, at World Trade Center Utah. I think Strider's another. And so I'm really optimistic. I know I'm talking about all the problems in the world. People are like, man, kind of depressing, but I really feel optimistic about our country. And we're still in the midst of these crises we've encountered. But I know your organization, Miles, and those who are on this call are going to be a big part of making sure we maintain our competitive advantages and build a better future for generations to come. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you. It's been a real pleasure.
Great. Thank you, General McMaster. You know, just yesterday, Boyd and I were on the radio talking, and we talked about how America's brightest days are ahead if we will heed the lessons that you have in battlegrounds that we've been talking about today. And if all of us find a way to make sure that we are being strategically competent, and if we are doing that at the individual level, the company level, the state level, and the national level, then there's no question as a country that we are going to rise to these challenges and overcome them and continue to be such an important leavening positive force in the world. Really comes down to individual decisions. And so thank you very much for your input today. And again, for everybody, Battlegrounds, the fight to defend the free world, please check it out. Phenomenal read. Reach out to us if you'd like to copy. And those who reach out first will be first come, first serve. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day.